Welcome back, friends, and I hope you all are doing absolutely fine. Today we are having a look on Chapter 10, Postmodernism. So, think of postmodernism as the moment literature and theory looked into the mirror and asked, can we ever trust what we see? Emerging in the mid-20th century, postmodernism was not just a continuation of modernism, but a deeper rupture. Modernism had already broken away from classical traditions, experimenting with new forms and questioning humanist ideals. But postmodernism went further. It challenged the very possibility of stable meaning itself. Pause here and note this: it did not revive classical scholarship and it did not promote logocentrism, and both of these points have been asked in exam. Instead, postmodernism insists that both language and identity are unstable, indeterminate, and endlessly shifting. This rejection of certainty becomes the hallmark of postmodern thought. Can you recall who sits at the center of this movement? Jacques Derrida, with his method of deconstruction, is perhaps its most iconic figure. Alongside him, thinkers like Michel Foucault, Roland Barthes, Jean-François Lyotard, Jean Baudrillard, Gilles Deleuze, Félix Guattari, Maurice Blanchot, Richard Rorty, Fredric Jameson, and Douglas Kellner expanded postmodernism's reach into literature, philosophy, and cultural theory. Lyotard's idea of the crisis of grand narratives, the rejection of sweeping, universal explanations of history and knowledge, was especially influential, and this too has been asked in exam. Here's something crucial: postmodernism introduces powerful concepts that you must remember for the exam. Words like hyperreality, simulacrum, trace, and difference, all asked in exam, point to a world where representation is fractured, meaning is endlessly deferred, and reality is mediated by signs and images. This directly links to the politics of identity, cultural fragmentation, and what Baudrillard described as a proliferation of simulations. Yes, that was also asked in exam. And it doesn't stop at theory. In literature, postmodernism shaped experimental writing and even science fiction. Cyberpunk, for example, blends postmodern techniques with posthumanist themes, often staging its stories in virtual realities. This blend of philosophy and pop culture made postmodernism feel alive and unsettling at the same time, and yes, cyberpunk in connection with postmodernism was asked in exam. Institutionally, the rise of journals also shows this shift. Boundary too became a central platform for postmodern theoretical analysis. Unlike journals such as Granta or Manova, which focused more on fiction and essays, this too has been directly asked in exam. So what does postmodernism ultimately give us? It dismantles universal validity claims, destabilizes fixed identities, and embraces pluralism. It reminds us that truth is never absolute, it is constructed, contested, and always in play. In other words, postmodernism isn't just a phase in history. It's an intellectual stance that keeps asking, who decides meaning and why should we trust it? Imagine a time when people believed science and technology could solve every problem. This was the spirit of high modernism. Most visible during the late 1950s and 1960s, especially in the Cold War years, it was marked by a strong faith in order, planning, and progress. Huge state projects, ambitious urban planning, and cultural confidence all reflected this belief that humans could impose order on chaos through rational mastery. But then came a shift. Scholars began questioning these sweeping promises of progress. This brings us to the idea of the grand narrative or meta-narrative, and pause here because this has been asked in exam. A grand narrative is a big overarching story that explains history or culture, like the narrative of human emancipation or inevitable progress. Societies often rely on these master stories to legitimize themselves. But postmodern thinkers expose their weakness. Such narratives cannot account for the diversity of identities and the fragmented nature of modern life. In short, the big story breaks down when faced with many small stories. Now let's step back to structuralism. And structuralism, we have already a depth discussion in the chapter 12. Structuralists believed there were universal patterns beneath human behavior and expression. Influenced by socialist linguistics, they treated literature as a system of signs and codes where meaning came from relationships rather than individual authors. For them, analysis was almost scientific. It was about rules, structures, and universality. But here's the twist. Post-structuralism grew out of this very school but rejected its certainty. And post-structuralism, we have already a depth discussion in the chapter 13. Post-structuralist thinkers argued that meaning is never stable, never final. Texts resist closure, and interpretation is always multiple. Instead of one universal science of culture, post-structuralism opened up a field of approaches, psychoanalysis, discourse analysis, and most famously, deconstruction. And now, let's carefully unpack deconstruction associated with Jacques Derrida. And the deconstruction, we have already a depth discussion in the chapter 14. So think of deconstruction as reading against the grain. A deconstructive reading doesn't just summarize a text, it looks for the tensions, paradoxes, and contradictions that undo the text's own claims. Pause here and note this down. Derrida shows us how binary oppositions like truth versus falsehood, speech versus writing, or male versus female don't actually hold firm. Texts unravel from within, showing meaning to be unstable and undecidable. So, in just a few decades, the intellectual journey moved from the optimism of high modernism to the skepticism of postmodernism and finally to the radical strategies of deconstruction. Together, these shifts remind us that literature and theory are never static. They evolve, question themselves, and push us to see meaning in new ways. Think about this. What if all the big stories we've been told about history and progress are no longer believable? That's the radical idea Jean-François Lyotard brought into philosophy and literary theory. Deeply influenced by Nietzsche's critique of truth, Lyotard became one of the most powerful voices of postmodern thought. In 1979, he published The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge, and pause here. This was asked in exam. This book was the first major philosophical text to use the term postmodernism. And here, Lyotard made his most famous claim, the end of grand narratives or meta-narratives. Now, what does that mean? Meta-narratives are those giant frameworks that promise universal explanations of the world. Things like Hegel's philosophy of history, Marx's socialism, or even the Enlightenment belief in progress. Lyotard argued that in the postmodern age, people no longer trust these big stories. Instead, our world is marked by pluralism, fragmentation, and skepticism. And this is absolutely key. It was also asked in exam. Then the Lyotard, pause here and note this down. Lyotard's definition is crystal clear. He writes, simplifying to the extreme, I defined postmodern as incredulity toward meta-narratives. Yes, this exact line has been asked in exam. It means we don't fully believe in totalizing truths anymore. Truth is not absolute. It's contingent, partial, and always shaped by context. Can you recall what idea supports this? Lyotard borrowed from Wittgenstein's language games and speech act theory. He explained that knowledge works in different forms, sometimes as expert technical discourse, sometimes as philosophical question. And in the age of computers, knowledge becomes fragmented data transmitted like information, not as a unified system. This is the turning point. Lyotard says the Enlightenment dream of universal reason is gone. Instead of one truth, we have many truths, each bound to its own context. Knowledge is always provisional, never final. So, through the postmodern condition, Lyotard gave us both a definition of postmodernism and a challenge. To see knowledge not as a grand story, but as a set of small local narratives always in play. That's why his work continues to shape debates in cultural theory, philosophy, and literary studies. Think of philosophy for a moment. For centuries, it was seen as a mirror, a discipline whose job was to reflect reality clearly and provide a solid foundation for knowledge. In 1979, Richard Rorty challenged this idea head-on in his influential book, Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature. Pause here and note this. Rorty argued that philosophy had trapped itself by trying to imitate the natural sciences. It wanted to act as a kind of super discipline that could guarantee objective truth. But in doing so, philosophy created an illusion that knowledge is about representing reality with perfect accuracy, as if our thoughts were mirrors reflecting the outside world. Now here's where Rorty flips the script. He criticized two long-standing traditions. First, representationalism, the belief that ideas are valid if they mirror external reality. Second, the correspondence theory of truth, the assumption that a statement is true if it directly matches an independent fact. Rorty exposed the hidden problem behind both. They assume that observers and phenomena exist separately and that the world is just passively waiting to be mirrored by human thought. Can you recall what Rorty proposed instead? He suggested a pragmatic view. Knowledge, he said, is not eternal or absolute but contingent, historical, and rooted in practice. In other words, truth is not about mirroring reality, it's about what works within a cultural and conversational context. This book dismantled the foundational ambitions of analytic philosophy. It broke away from the idea that philosophy's role was to find ultimate truths. Instead, Rorty opened the door to postmodern and neo-pragmatist approaches, ones that emphasize discourse, practice, and culture over rigid accuracy. So for your exam prep, remember this. Rorty's philosophy and the mirror of nature marks a turning point. It shifts philosophy from chasing objective mirrors to embracing the messy, pragmatic, and context-driven nature of human understanding. Have you ever wondered if what we call reality is actually real, or if it's just a web of images and signs that we've learned to accept as truth? That's exactly the unsettling question Jean Baudrillard, one of the boldest postmodern thinkers, put before us. In his famous work, Simulacra and Simulation, published in 1981, asked in exam, Baudrillard argued that modern life is no longer about reality being represented, it's about reality being produced by science. Think about it. When we see endless ads, films, or digital feeds, are we looking at reality or at models that create a new kind of reality altogether? He called this state the hyperreal. Pause here and write this down. Baudrillard's key claim is that in the postmodern age, signs don't simply reflect the real, they generate realities of their own. His striking phrase captures it. Simulation is no longer that of a territory or substance, but the generation of a real without origin, a hyperreal. Can you recall the most controversial example he gave? It was in his essay, The Gulf War Never Happened. Asked in exam. No, he wasn't denying that bombs fell or people suffered. What he meant was that for the global audience, the war was experienced mainly through television broadcasts, codes, and images, so much so that the media spectacle replaced the war itself. The event became a simulation. Now, here's something to think about. Baudrillard believed that in late capitalism, we live surrounded by layers of images, reproductions, and representations. These signs circulate freely with no stable reality beneath them. Disneyland, fashion magazines, video games, even social media, they blur the line between what is real and what is representation. So, in Baudrillard's world, truth itself becomes unstable. The real is no longer something we access directly, it's mediated, coded, and simulated. That's why his ideas of simulacra and hyperreality remain crucial for understanding postmodern media, technology, and culture. Next time you scroll through Instagram or watch a glossy news broadcast, pause and ask yourself, are you seeing reality or just another simulation of it? Think of postmodernism. And one name you can't afford to miss is Fredric Jameson, a leading Marxist literary theorist born in 1934. He is the thinker who gave us one of the first big comprehensive accounts of postmodernism. Pause here and note this down. It was asked in exam. His famous lectures at the Whitney Museum were later expanded into the landmark book Postmodernism, or The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, published in 1991. Jameson argued that postmodernism isn't just a style or an art movement. Instead, it is the cultural logic of late capitalist society itself. That means it reflects the fragmentation, commodification, and media saturation of global culture. In other words, postmodernism is how culture looks when shaped by advanced capitalism. One of his most exam-focused ideas is the difference between parody and pastiche. Pause here, this was asked in exam. Parody needs a stable norm to mock, it's satirical, it has a target, but pastiche is different, it's neutral. A flat imitation with no satire, no critical edge. For Jameson, this depthless imitation becomes the hallmark of postmodern art, where originality collapses under endless replication. And there's more. Borrowing from Lacanian psychoanalysis, Jameson used the metaphor of schizophrenia to describe how postmodern culture breaks down temporal continuity. Instead of a coherent sense of history, we get fragmented images, a kind of eternal present with no depth. Don't miss this. Jameson also gave us another major work, The Political Unconscious Narrative as a Socially Symbolic Act, published in 1981, asked in exam. In it, he argued that all narrative is political. Every story, whether it admits it or not, encodes ideological struggles. Literature, he said, is not neutral. It's a socially symbolic act that reflects history, ideology, and culture. Drawing on structuralists like Greimas and Levi-Strauss, Jameson showed that narrative itself is a key to decoding collective experience. So here's the takeaway. Fredric Jameson helps us see postmodernism as both a cultural dominant and a historical condition of capitalism. At the same time, through his Marxist criticism, he reminds us that literature is never just entertainment. It is always political, always symbolic, always tied to its historical moment. Think for a moment about how much technology shapes our everyday lives, our phones, our screens, our constant flow of digital information. Now, imagine a cultural critic who says that no theory of society or culture can be complete if it ignores this reality. That's where Douglas Kellner comes in. Born in 1943, Kellner is one of the key voices linking postmodernism with media and technology. Pause here and note this. Kellner called his approach an analysis of the journey. He argued that the assumptions and methods of older, modern theories no longer work. Why? Because they can't explain the complexities of a world dominated by media, mass communication, and digital technology. For Kellner, theory must connect with lived experience. It can't remain an abstract puzzle, it has to speak to real life. What makes his work distinctive is how he weaves science and technology studies into postmodern cultural critique. He says clearly, without understanding how media and technology shape identity, discourse, and even power relations, any critical theory of culture is incomplete. Can you recall why this is important? Because unlike earlier theorists who often treated culture in isolation, Kellner insists that technology is at the heart of how we live and think today. So when we talk about postmodernism, he pushes us further. It's not enough to analyze fragmentation, pastiche, or instability of meaning. We also have to study cyberculture, digital communication, and global media systems. Only then can cultural theory truly capture the world we inhabit. In this way, Douglas Kellner becomes a bridge figure. He takes the concerns of postmodernism language, power, identity, and extends them into the technological domain. His reminder is simple but crucial. Postmodern theory without technology is incomplete because technology now defines the very conditions of modern life. And with that, we've completed Chapter 10, Postmodernism Unlocked. From the roots of postmodernism to the key thinkers like Lyotard, Baudrillard, Jameson, and Douglas Kellner, you now have the full toolkit to tackle this topic with confidence. Remember, this chapter isn't just about theory. It's about understanding how ideas of language, power, technology, and culture shape the very way we see the world. Everything you need is already waiting for you in the app lesson videos, detailed PDFs, last-minute revision notes, classroom notes, and previous year questions. So pause here, revise, and reinforce what you've learned. And don't forget, you can download the app anytime to access all notes and practice materials at your fingertips.